Hello, everyone. My name is Dylan Judd, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the Yale School of the Environment. For the past 12 years, BIOMES, short for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Methods in Environmental Studies, has served as the school's premier platform for bringing groundbreaking research to the YSE community. I am honored to introduce today's BIOMES speaker, Dr. Katharine Mach, the Coleman P. Burke Distinguished Visiting Professor here at YSE. Mach is a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science. Her research assesses climate change risks and response options to address increased flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, and other hazards, culminating in over 100 peer-reviewed publications. Before this appointment, Mach graduated with her bachelor's degree in biology and a language citation in French from Harvard College in 2004 and received her PhD in biological science from Stanford University in 2010. From 2010 to 2015, she co-directed the scientific activities of Working Group 2 for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report and its special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. Mach then served simultaneously as a visiting investigator at the Carnegie Institute's Department of Global Ecology and as a senior research scientist and the director of the Stanford Environment Assessment Facility at Stanford University. She also was a chapter lead for the U.S. Fifth National Climate Assessment and a lead author for the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report. She serves as co-editor-in-chief for Climate Risk Management and editorial board member for both Oxford Open Climate Change and Environmental Research Climate, an advisory committee member for the Aspen Global Change Institute, and a member of the National Academy's Climate Security Roundtable. As a result, Mach was the 2020 recipient of the Piers Sellers Prize for her outstanding contributions to solution-focused climate research. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mach to the stage.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been an awesome experience to be here as part of the Coleman P. Burke Distinguished Visiting Professorship Program. I see some students from class here as well. I've never had a class more packed with students who are passionate, creative, and brilliant. And hopefully, I will manage to teach them something over the course of this semester. And more broadly, it's been wonderful to meet so many people across campus and think about new directions. So what I will do today is introduce my work in a nutshell. I'm going to start with the glasses through which I see the world, how I think about the complexity of climate risk and the current status of climate adaptation globally, and how that really unfolds some clear needs for research in this space. I will then take this approach and walk you through two examples that have caught my imagination over the last few years. One, thinking about some of the very complex interactions and trade-offs that happen when you experience a climate shock, not just for a few days at a time, but for months on end. Second example, focusing on chronic heat. And then, since maybe we're all in need of some optimism, I will look at some research where we've basically unfolded the fact that there are a lot of successes historically that have gone shockingly unrecognized in the space of how we reduce flood risk moving forward. Okay, so to start out, there's one thing to take home from my introductory view here. The glasses through which I see the world involve a lot of complexity of climate risk, climate adaptations that are proliferating, but for real needs for our knowledge to better serve society and increasing preparedness moving forward. This calls for an integrative, decision-relevant, action-oriented, and ultimately very collaborative approach. 2025 has been a banner year for climate complexity, almost no matter how you cut it. I might start with this slide that shows global average temperatures from 1850 to the present. For those of us who have our eyes on the global temperature goal, that goal is, probably a lot of you could repeat it, limiting warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursuing 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial times. So 2024 was the first year, which we learned at the start of this year, where we exceeded that 1.5 sea level at the global scale for an entire year. I also like this diagram in that I can go back through time and think about the 80s and the 90s when climate adaptation was really just emerging. It was kind of something people did not want to talk about because it seemed like it would detract necessary attention from reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. And then by contrast, if we sail to the present, it is now unambiguously the case that the most important adaptation is reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases at the same time that we need to increase preparedness in many other different ways. But this plot ultimately is pretty abstract, and it doesn't really give a feel for complexity of the changing climate in terms of the risks we experience. So in the next slides, I'll run through a few different domains of climate complexity that I tend to think about. Number one, any context of climate risk that we look at involves many different determinants. So climate change is accelerating, intensifying the risks, but to address them, to reduce them, we need to untangle all of these different determinants of risk. For example, is profoundly realized in the Los Angeles fires that we've seen this year. Important to note in this context, there has been a huge amount of work in California to adapt to wildfire risk, home hardening, community preparedness, fire breaks, insurance reforms, and these types of risks that many would deem as intolerable are happening on top of a lot of efforts to reduce those risks already. Another key descriptor for climate risk in the world around us today is unprecedented. Hurricane Helene would be one example of this, a hurricane that roared up North America, and in Western North Carolina, flash floods obliterated towns and infrastructure in communities where they didn't know they had a flood risk issue. They were not mapped into flood zones. And what we know from our efforts to increase preparedness to date is that we're pretty good at increasing preparedness for things we have already experienced. We really are not good at preparing for the unprecedented. Big challenge moving forward. Another key domain in the space of climate risk is what many people call new normals. For example, the flooding that might happen on the high tides, outside of storms, outside of disaster contexts. The social and economic impacts of this type of new normal, whether it's flooding or heat or desertification, really has been heavily underestimated to date. And we see people going along, getting along with their daily activities, but there are wide open questions about when limits will be reached in these contexts of new normals. A final aspect of climate risk complexity that I will highlight is that what happens in any one place tends to cascade across space, across places, and through time. One example of this that we worked up in the National Climate Assessment is thinking about the Camp Fire, which came through Paradise, California in 2018. It was a massive fire, killed around 90 people, destroyed over 19,000 structures, and 50,000 people were displaced. Paradise itself, in the current day, has rebuilt in a reduced density format with fire resilience as a big priority. But when we think about the consequences, it's really important to look beyond Paradise. So as 50,000 people were displaced from this fire, many of them ended up just down the Sierra foothills into the valley in Chico, California. The population of Chico increased wildly, literally overnight. It already had a housing affordability crisis, but this now became a crisis of traffic and sewage treatment facilities that were completely overwhelmed. As the year plus progressed, then the telework era began with the COVID pandemic, and housing affordability across the Central Valley became even more acute of an issue. So in terms of then the social and political dynamics of this fire that started in Paradise years prior, a political action committee really came into power, raising alarm about housing prices that were skyrocketing, homeless encampments that were growing, raising fears of crime and drug. That led to a whole different era of housing policy, really emphasizing evictions and criminalizing of those who were unsheltered, recognizing that Indigenous people were heavily represented in those who were unsheltered. Then in this region, as we draw it to the current day, it is a region that has seen fire after fire, and whether it's Paradise or Chico, thinking about not just the direct risks of the flame, but the risks of the air quality and the enduring consequences is really important. Okay, climate risk is complex. I hope we have established that. The next feature is that climate responses are also complex in some really important ways in terms of increasing preparedness to intensifying climate change. I'll draw from examples today in Miami-Dade County, Florida, where I am from. And these images here just scrape the surface of a proliferating set of plans and strategies and actions across agencies of government, across community organizations, across businesses as well. It's not just Miami-Dade. Pretty much anywhere we look, we see this rapid emergence of climate adaptations. Those of you in my class hopefully know this diagram by heart by now. It is one of the few places where the networks of actors working on sea level rise adaptation in this context have been quantified. And what we see is that up to 2007, there were about 82 government offices, community organizations, or businesses working on sea level rise adaptation in the Bay Area. 82. Jump forward just one decade to 2016, and that number rises to 647, right? An explosion of governance, an abundance of governance in the space of trying to rein in damages here from sea level rise. Okay, next question. Is all of this effort to prepare and adapt working? This is where it gets very complex. I, along with hundreds of other adaptation scientists and scholars globally, have tried really hard to answer this question. And those students taking my class know why. This is a very hard endeavor. What is adaptation? It is so many different things simultaneously, processes, outcomes across pretty much every aspect of the human endeavor. But this is a summary slide from one of our best attempts to say, in this case, for coastal contexts around the globe, both urban and rural, how are we doing? What is the current status of adaptation? And it was a very, very detailed analysis. This is just this final summary plot. In that top wedge there, we see that there is a lot of assessment of risks, figuring out the problems we face. As we wind around the subsequent wedges, we see that there's some progress globally in building out plans for adaptation and starting to take actions to reduce risk from a changing climate and to build capacities. Where it really falls off a cliff, though, is in the last two wedges there. Number one, globally, we have almost no evidence on what actions are actually reducing climate-related risks, so we're kind of flying blind in terms of knowing what is working. And the last wedge there, the pathway approach one, almost never are we figuring out, do what I do today, does it take me onto a pathway of longer-term preparedness? So for example, if I put in a backflow preventer, definitely helps with sea level rise driven flooding today. Does it help with 4 feet of sea level rise? Far from clear that we are on a trajectory to that greater preparedness. One way that we have visualized this is in a slightly more artistic rendering of the subway diagrams that often proliferate in the adaptation pathways space. We've got a hypothetical settlement, pick a coastline globally, and when we think about what might it look like into the future, pretty clearly, whether it's flooding or storms or sea level rise or fire or drought, the future is going to look a lot different than it does today if we're going to rein in those types of risks. So putting these pieces together, my approach to researching climate risk and adaptation is to keep these 3 things in my back pocket. Number one, a real recognition that climate risks arise not just from hazards exacerbated in a changing climate, but from factors that can vary individual to individual that are strongly shaped by our social and economic and governance systems. Number two, no scientist is going to adapt on their own. Adaptation touches every part of the human experience, and therefore, there's a crucial recognition that different knowledges of the decision context, of institutions, of politics, of local context, absolutely crucial for the prospects of adaptation moving forward, really necessitating more collaborative approaches. And then finally, there's a wide open question of, in the context of increasing preparedness, when do we need to radically innovate and do new things, as compared to when do we need to draw from tried and true approaches and maybe just apply them in new ways. So across the projects that I'll introduce in the next 2 segments of the talk, these pillars will be there through methods like integrative assessment, applied decision and policy analysis, and a multidisciplinary set of methods that we call the science of actionable knowledge. So climate risk is complex, adaptations are happening everywhere, but we have a long way to go in terms of increasing preparedness moving forward. I will now take this into the space of chronic heat. And what I will unfold here is that when climate hazards last for months at a time, the trade-offs that are involved involve a lot of interconnections that we have infrequently quantified. And if we want to understand the true scope and distribution of climate risk, we need to think about these interconnections, and these interconnections are foundational to the prospects for effective adaptation solutions into the future. All right. When we think about extreme heat, up here in this latitude, it's easy to think about heat waves. But a framework that we've really been pushing forward, coming from a subtropical latitude that has a seasonally tropical climate, I should say, is that the nature of dangerous extreme heat takes different forms. And for those of you who think a lot about heat, yes, there are millions of metrics for extreme heat. But here I'm going to think about a spectrum that ranges from heat that comes in heat waves versus heat that lasts for months or even the full year at a time. So this is a bit of a complicated map, but I love it, so I'm going to walk you through it carefully here. So this axis here shows the number of heat waves that have occurred historically from 1986 to 2016, as defined by the World Meteorological Organization. So 5 days, 5 degrees Celsius above normal. So what we see here, this is the shading across the Earth, is that places in high latitudes, by these definitions, have a ton of heat waves. I think those of us who have followed deaths during Russian heat waves are very aware of these risks that are posed. Does anyone notice anything unusual? If we look at the parts of the world that are black, basically no heat waves, or fewer than 10 in the historic record, most of what we think of as the hottest places on Earth have no heat waves as historically defined. So here we bring in another metric for station data around the globe, and it corresponds to this axis here. So this is showing from the 90s to the current day, the average number of days per year where the heat index in a given location has exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and showing that for areas where for more than 3 months of the year, you're above 90 degrees Fahrenheit heat index. It's wild if you look at, for example, South and Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, almost every day is in this territory of dangerous heat. Where I'll be unfolding research here, you can see that there is a lot of chronic heat, but still far from what it can look like in the highest levels that we see around the globe. What is remarkable is that despite this different forms of extreme heat, the literature, research, science has disproportionately focused on the impacts of heat waves in these types of latitudes. And the wisdom has been that if it's hot all the time, you hang out in air-conditioned spaces. So where does that fall flat? If we think, for example, of outdoor workers, major exposure to chronic season-long heat, whether that's dry heat or humid chronic heat. Many indoor workers can be very dangerously exposed as well. Those on the commute may have dangerous conditions. And then finally, linked to some of the work I'll describe in particular here, what happens when you can't cool your indoor home environment? There can be a lot of different reasons for which this is the case, which we unfold in this work. And the basic rub is that if we think about the cumulative exposures in these locations that are hot for months of the year, your exposure to heat, the risks you experience from heat, are highly differentiated across the population. So the top rows here show 4 different exposure scenarios. So imagine an individual here through every hour of the day who's exposed to high temperatures at home, then at work, and then at home again. That person here would have very high cumulative exposure across the course of a day, and then you might add up that day across months of the year to think about the total exposure to heat. By contrast, you might have people who are exposed only at home or only at work, bringing you to kind of this moderate level of exposure. And then you have people like me, and probably like many of you if you were to live in a tropical location, where it's really at our discretion when we experience extreme heat. For me, it might be more like running at sunrise as compared to basketball at 6 p.m., but the condition holds. And I think what's really remarkable is that these outcomes have been very under-quantified in terms of their total cumulative impacts and risks. We've been doing work on both the outdoor exposures in chronic climates, as well as the incidental exposures that happen in other commute-like contexts, but what I'll describe here is work that we've been doing to understand the experience with heat at home, where home really should be our ultimate sanctuary. And this work is rooted in the concept that so much of the research to date on the dangers from chronic heat have focused either on heat in isolation or on energy burden in isolation. So how much money you are paying, for example, to run air conditioning to keep your home cool. But if you look at the individual factors that drive up risk, if you look at the household factors that drive up risk, if you look at the societal neighborhood domains that drive up risk, what's fascinating is that they're actually really similar across these two different domains of heat exposure at home and what it costs to keep your home cool. So we brought these different aspects of energy and heat together to ask, first of all, what does indoor heat look like in a chronically hot city? And if you were to go to City Hall and listen to hearings, the wisdom is that everyone has air conditioning. It's not a problem at home. However, what we've seen in a place like Miami-Dade is the same as many other tropical places around the world, is households will say, my issue is that it is way too hot at home. So when households say they're too hot, what does that look like? Question number one. Number two, how do we understand this interconnection between your choice for your heat exposure at home and your choice for how much you pay to try to keep your indoor home environment cool? What types of trade-offs are happening there? And then third of all, for households that are too hot or are paying a big fraction of their income to try to cool their homes, what pathways lead them to those spaces of risk, and what do we know about what effective solutions might look like accordingly? This research was very interdisciplinary, also conducted in partnership with community organizations and local governments throughout Southeast Florida. The PhD students who led this work are appropriately called the Superheat Trio, drawing from very different disciplinary backgrounds. Myra, an expert in public health, Lene in engineering, thinking about heat moving through the built environment, Kos in meteorology. I'll point out Kos will be here for induction into the Boucher Graduate Honor Society in April. On the faculty side, my co-lead, Amy Clement, is an expert in climate science. And then Natalia Brown is now at Harvard Law School, but at the time she was working at Catalyst Miami, and she was our key contact in a lot of the neighborhoods where they work very extensively. So our recruitment strategy was to recruit a maximally diverse sample across the county of households who said they are too hot at home or their energy bill is too high. We recruited in the 3 major languages relevant in Southeast Florida: English, Haitian Creole, and Spanish. We looked at households across the geography of the region from different social and economic backgrounds, and also in different building types and ownership status, so renters and owners, for example. Dropping off sensors at all of these homes required the students to drive 800 miles for drop-off and pickup, just giving a sense of how big the northern part and the southern portion of the county are. To make measurements within the home, we use heat and humidity sensors. We also use sensors that, via the cloud, delivered the data automatically to us. This reduces a lot of the burden on participants, and it also meant that if we observed a household becoming dangerously hot over the course of the study, per our IRB protocol, we could intervene, although I will say that the limited set of options to address that heat was sobering and really pointed to a lot of the partnerships and activities we've done moving forward. So every 10 minutes, we had a temperature and a humidity measurement in these households. And then the first thing we did was to say, okay, what does heat look like in the households? Here I'll show just temperature data, and in the subsequent slides, I will turn to heat index, the feels like temperature that also encompasses humidity. So we took 19 different variables to describe temperature in the home, many, many ways to define temperature. Also thinking about the relationship between outdoor and indoor temperature and correlation across seasons of the year. We squashed down these 19 variables via very max rotated principal component analysis and then clustered them. If that was jargon, don't worry about it. What I will show here is the so what. So we basically found 4 different clusters based on these 4 principal components of smoothness, variability, averages, and predictability. I'm going to show this in terms of what this looked like in terms of 2 weeks only, because it's much more intuitive than that previous plot. So we had households that we called diurnal cool. So in each of these plots, for 2 weeks of data in August of 2022, the black data show temperature measurements at the Miami International Airport. Continuous measurements as well as the daily average, or the 2-week average, I should say. The red data show the sensor data within one home representative of each of those clusters. So diurnal cool, they've got a low set point. You see that predictable diurnal signal, and they're staying very comfortable in the home. Diurnal moderate, same sort of thing, but with a higher set point. Noisy moderate would be the engineer's nightmare, so no sort of predictable relationship between outdoor and indoor temperatures. Some households were fighting over the set point of the thermostat, so there could be really diverse explanations for what was going on in this type of household. Then we had the households of concern, so what we call diurnal hot. So you can see this household that is basically mirroring the outdoor temperatures. So for anyone who's spent time in a hot tropical summertime climate, try spending 1 hour of the day outdoors. It's fierce. Thinking about this as every hour of the day is really a wild experience. You can then look at some of the other houses that we had in this cluster, and it could get even worse. We actually had a number of houses that were functioning as greenhouses, so they actually were hotter than the outdoor temperatures, never reaching the daily lows. And here you can see a number of different patterns in this hottest cluster of homes. Okay, now, what types of trade-offs were occurring? What we saw is that you really have to look at heat and energy insecurity together to understand the full scope of household risks. In this plot, each data point represents one of the 57 households, here for June, September, and October, in what we call the caution months, so when the outdoor temperature, as defined by the National Weather Service, is at a caution level. And on the vertical axis for each home, we plot its average heat index over these 3 months of the heat season, as compared to its energy burden, or the fraction of income for that household going towards their electricity bill, predominantly to keep the house cool, air conditioning. Okay, this line here at 82 degrees Fahrenheit heat index in a tropical climate is a good ballpark indicator for a home that is above that, getting too hot, below that, in a more safe range. If 82 seems really hot to you, keep in mind people are somewhat acclimatized, wearing tank tops and shorts, a different environment as compared to what you would do for Connecticut, say, in terms of a measure of thermal comfort. The vertical line here shows 6% energy burden, which is the federal definition, at least still today, of energy poverty. And so what we can then see is different households fall into different parts here. And this blue area corresponds to households that are staying in a comfortable temperature range and paying less than 6% of their income to stay in that range. Then we have heat-burdened households where they are experiencing high heat, but they're keeping their energy bills pretty low. The flip side here are the energy-burdened households where they are choosing to pay a large fraction of their income to stay cool. And we also had some that were both heat and energy burdened, so paying a lot, like up to $500 a month on a very small fixed income, and still in very dangerous temperature levels. If we then look at the very hottest months of summer, July and August, we see a shift out of the blue into the other quadrants. And just to drive this home, this dotted line here represents the average outdoor heat index for these months of July and August. And we had these 6 households that were functioning as greenhouses, a lot hotter than the outdoor conditions. And we had energy burden up to 30%. Anyone who works in this space, this is a really staggering level of energy burden. Okay, so what? How are these households doing? We did very extensive interviews. I won't present those data today. I'll just show a few survey questions from the exit surveys. These were self-reports from the households for 5 different questions that I'm showing here, saying yes or no. Do you feel too hot at home? Are you experiencing physical or mental health impacts? Are you limiting your AC use? Do you find your energy bill affordable? And are you foregoing critical expenses like for food or for medicine in order to pay your energy bill? In each one of these, the top row corresponds to households that were both heat and energy burdened. The next row corresponds to households that were just energy burdened, then just heat burdened, and N, neither heat nor energy burdened. And unsurprisingly, the households that are in those trade-off quadrants are hotter at home, experiencing physical or mental health issues. And here it's actually kind of interesting in that the households that are choosing to pay a lot of their income to try to keep their home cool, whether or not it's working, are actually more susceptible to the physical health impacts in their perception, might be why they are choosing to pay so much to try to stay cool. Similarly, the hot households are limiting AC use, finding their energy bills far from affordable, and we see a lot of foregoing of critical expenses to pay energy bills. We then applied a set theoretic method called fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis to basically look in a way that's really informed by theory, informed by data on the ground, combinations of factors that are leading households to these spaces of high heat exposure at home or high energy burden. And there were 4 major pathways through which households arrived at heat or energy burdened. 3 of them involve low-income households. Number 1, low-income households where the AC unit was ineffective. Either they're a renter and the central air conditioning does not work at all or is basically broken, or they've got a window unit that even at max volume is barely cooling the room. Next, you have households that you could say in some ways are really trying to do the right thing. They are in housing that you can cool, that does have adequate air conditioning in most cases, but they are paying so much of their income towards housing, there is nothing left over to keep the house cool. Number 3 is kind of the flip side of that issue. So if you were to say, all right, I'll go for the poor quality housing, where maybe the roof has all sorts of issues or the windows are ancient and leaky, then you basically have houses that even with moderate income cannot be kept cool. And then finally, low-income single-parent households were also highly at risk. And what's interesting is that classic social vulnerability analysis will take usually a geographically aggregated approach. And what we found is that oftentimes a household could be in a high-income neighborhood but still have one of these sets of factors at play, and you would miss them if you assume this was only a neighborhood-by-neighborhood phenomenon. And then you can say, okay, each of these different categories of issues have unique policy solutions, whether we're thinking about improving the air conditioning, housing assistance, AC rebates, or also recognizing that many programs already exist for single-parent households. Could energy be wrapped into them as well? Finally, by doing this work in partnership with local government and community organizations through what we call the Urban Heat Research Group with monthly meetings as well as lots of spin-off conversations, the neat thing is that we have been able to provide evidence in real time that has directly informed emerging heat policy in Miami-Dade County as well as partner regions that tend to join in terms of national learning on these issues. So in sum, if we think about an approach attuned to integrative understanding of climate risks, attuned to decision relevance, and we apply that in a context of chronic heat, we unfold the ways that interconnections are really essential for the total complex risks that people face, and also those interconnections are essential for thinking about avenues for solutions. The last example I'll give is a slightly briefer one, looking at some of the success stories that we have missed historically, especially thinking about law and policy tools relevant to putting stuff, houses, infrastructure, commercial developments into safer locations. This work over the past 6 years or so has revolved around 2 different questions. Number 1, how often are floodplain communities limiting development in the floodplain? They don't have a flood problem because they are putting people outside of the floodplain. Number 2, if these cases exist, reviewers for our NSF grant thought we would actually find no one who is limiting floodplain development. If they exist, what law and policy tools are enabling this more proactive risk reduction? So coming back to this diagram, when people think about, how will we adapt to higher magnitude climate change into the future? If you're on a coastal environment, usually the imagination first goes to, we'll build a wall. Okay, walls are super expensive and they don't work in many different parts of the US, much less the global coastline. So then oftentimes people say, well, we'll elevate structures onto stilts. And this is against a backdrop where in some ways our predominant activity to date has been to reclaim the wetland, to build out in flood-prone places, assuming that we can control where floodwaters go. In all of this, 2 categories of strategies related to land use planning have often been heavily overlooked. Number 1, I'll start on the bottom here, retreat. So the idea that we'll decide to undevelop, remove houses, infrastructure from a place that's flooding again and again, and restore that land to a floodplain that can keep other people safe by enabling the waters to go there instead. I've done a ton of work on retreat. It is about the most complicated example of adaptation. It is both a loss and a benefit. There's no such thing as a perfect retreat. It always involves very intense trade-offs. So what we tried to do in this work was to say, how about avoid? Usually, when we study flooding, we look at places that have had terrible flood disasters. We basically select on the dependent. And for those of you who think about statistics, there's some real issues built in there that we'll see here emerging. And we say, okay, for places that have a flood issue, what do they do to then reduce that flood issue? We have seldom looked for those places that, kind of like eating your broccoli for decades and then avoiding heart disease, have taken measures to avoid floodplain development and then do not have flood damages thereafter. So this is work that, again, has been hugely interdisciplinary. The PIs for the project, Miyuki Hino, A.R. Siders, and me, working with students from law and statistics and engineering, working very closely with FEMA and a number of different state agencies relevant in this work as well. And so what we did, first of all, was to create nationwide metrics of floodplain development relevant to the flood hazard communities face. Acronym CITY here is just for those of you who know what these data sets are, but we basically took data sets looking at properties across the entirety of the United States. We took data sets looking at impervious surface as a measure of development across all different forms, again, across the entirety of the United States. We combined that with the existing regulatory flood hazard maps. Yes, I know these greatly underestimate flood hazard extent. However, they are the ones that have been available to communities, so hard to kind of expect that someone would react to flooding that hasn't been mapped. That's why we use these regulatory flood maps. And then we made a suite of different measurements to understand patterns of development, again, relative to the hazard that floodplain communities face. So here to unfold one of our metrics, which we call the Floodplain Housing Index, I'm going to use a hypothetical circle city. So the circle here represents the developable land in a given town. We're going to walk through three scenarios. One where that town has limited floodplain development relative to the flood hazard it faces. One where its expected development follows what you would expect based on random chance. And then finally, one where development by contrast has been concentrated in the floodplain. Floodplain in each of these communities is blue, white is outside of the floodplain, and each community has built 6 houses over the time that we're looking at it. So in each case, the share of new housing going into the floodplain is 0.5, 50%. But what is shifting here is how much of the developable land is in floodplain. So values less than 1 indicate communities that, relative to the flood hazard they face, are limiting development in the floodplain. What you'd expect based on random chance, rolling the dice in your Monopoly city here, as compared to concentrating floodplain development if this value is greater than 1. We looked at this both for housing, FHI, the Floodplain Housing Index, as well as all development overall, FDI, the Floodplain Development Index. Okay, so this is either totally obvious or absolutely shocking. We had an NSF reviewer for this project say they didn't expect that we would find a single community, and here community is defined under FEMA in effect, across the entirety of the United States that is limiting development in the floodplain based on what you'd expect based on random chance alone. This is something about the blinders that we all wear, in that what we found was actually only 26% of the communities across the entirety of the United States are building out their floodplain more than you would expect on the basis of chance relative to the flood hazard they face. So not just one community is limiting floodplain development, actually 74% of the over 18,000 communities where we could do this assessment are limiting floodplain development. We just don't tend to think about the nature of these success stories. We also asked in detail a number of research questions, which I won't go into too much depth, about who is living in floodplains around the United States. And what we found is that actually there is more at both extremes than there is in the center in terms of who lives in floodplains across the United States. So for example, communities on this side of the spectrum, the floodplain price ratio reflects expensive floodplain housing. Communities on this side of the spectrum represents affordable floodplain housing. You know, the boggy swamp that is the naturally affordable housing in a given area. Another way to look at these data is through this plot, which I will then split additionally into inland versus coastal communities. So to make this comparison nature-wide, it actually was quite complex given data quality across states. So I won't go into all of the details, but we basically assessed for every state the most reliable measure of property value. And then we percentiled all of the households, all of the properties in each state, and then compared across states on the basis of percentile. So what we see here nationwide is that property value percentile on the affordable side versus the expensive side, in both cases, had more development in the floodplain than houses towards the center of the property value spectrum. If we look at inland communities, we see a lot of affordable floodplain housing occurring in inland communities, affordable but dangerous, and also some expensive floodplain housing, although that really goes through the roof in terms of coastal regions. This is really important from a public policy perspective because if we assume floodplain houses are mostly like this, and in fact they're more here and more there, you get very different implications for the needs for effective policy design and reform moving forward. And so the last thing we did was then say, what's happening? If we have learned that most communities are limiting floodplain development, surprise, what is going on? What are the tools that are applied? What are the factors at play? We ended up looking at this question in New Jersey, not because of convenient sampling. Not a single one of us is from New Jersey, although some of the students were, but because it's a great state to ask this question. And New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and FEMA, very happy to work in partnership regarding that state as the context. It's a state where there's a lot of development, a lot of pressure on land use, also relatively high local autonomy in terms of the actions that local governments could take. And our framework for thinking about what local governments are doing was shaped through this spectrum here, similar to a risk diagram, although I realize you don't see the word risk there. But first of all, you've got the context. Whoops. You've got the context. Is a given community inland or coastal, high wealth or lower income? What is the capacity of that local government? Does it have a huge local government staff or one person who is doing it all? Next, and I'll get through in a few slides to the examples of which different floodplain management and land use actions we looked at, but what is the nature of the actions being taken by that local government? Importantly, how do those actions shape development patterns in floodplains, outside of floodplains? We did not look at elevation of those homes, although we're doing that in current work that I'll maybe be able to present in the future. And then at the net end of this risk spectrum, you would have a clear correlation if you basically say households exposed, their level of vulnerability, and the damage and risk level that corresponds. So most of floodplain management research to date has focused on the connections here in blue, zooming down to damages and skipping this intermediary step of development. And so what we wanted to do on the left here is think hard about contextual factors and actions that lead to shifts in floodplain development. We looked across the state of New Jersey at 3 different spatial scales, given a real trade-off between sample size and data richness. So for the state as a whole, we looked at things like geographic factors, socioeconomic factors, some measures of actions taken, and yes, those development outcomes that we have nationwide, not just in New Jersey. We zoomed into 4 counties in particular, looking at their hazard mitigation plans as an indicator of local capacity. And then finally, for 4 municipalities where we spent weeks on the ground and did a lot of legal analysis of every town code related to flooding, we asked why, and in particular, what's happening in the space of enforcement of rules on the books. So here we see a stacked bar chart for all of the communities in New Jersey. The red ones up here in total are places that are building out their floodplain more than you'd expect on the basis of chance alone for both housing and all of their development, like infrastructure and commercial installations. Then you have in purple communities where it's a mixed bag. Either floodplain housing is being limited or floodplain development, but not both. Then you have the biggest bar in light blue here, places that are limiting both floodplain housing and floodplain development. And in fact, there were 126 communities across New Jersey that placed no houses into the floodplain over the last few decades. And you can see that playing out in the coastal versus inland locations. We picked 4 case studies to think more deeply about what is happening in that local government context. And I think what was remarkable, when we talked with FEMA, when we talked with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, when we talked with staff members and residents in Lumberton and Aberdeen, across the board, they would say, we're not doing anything special. Like, why in the world are you here to think about what we've done with regard to flooding? We don't have a flood problem. And that, in some ways, was exactly the point. So here we see, for those 4 towns, through these symbols that appear across here, if there is a circle present, the presence of that tool. And then for both the quality, so you can think about like the rigor of the standard, as well as how consistently it is being not just implemented, but enforced, either low, medium, or high levels. And for each of these communities, in some ways, it was a relatively simple story. So Lumberton, for example, was heavily using transfer of development rights to preserve open farmland. Aberdeen was conserving a recreational area along the water, zoning for affordable housing, and also using buyouts to undevelop in some hazardous locations. Woodbridge, heavily reliant on buyouts, making big successes in removing housing from the floodplain. But I was the person who spent weeks on the ground in Woodbridge. You know, it's kind of where New York City gets its Amazon boxes. The coastal area was filled with commercial warehouses, and that was the exposure they faced in the floodplain. Weehawken had the fewest tools, and surprisingly, it really was not prioritizing limiting development in the floodplain, and they were very upfront with that. And they actually were the only place where we saw development that was occurring out over the water, not just within the floodplain. So moving all of this forward, we've been thinking hard about some of these insights from the empirical past and how we transition towards moonshot scenarios of adaptation for the future. Also working in partnership with many different communities, residents, and local governments through more collaborative modes of flood modeling to enable that type of iterative creative exploration of possible futures and desired priorities. So to bring this to a wrap, there are 3 things I've talked about today. Number 1, given the complexity of climate risk, the status of adaptation today, I think an integrative, decision-relevant, action-oriented approach is essential in research. And I hope you have gotten a flavor of how you can take this type of approach and untangle some of the complexity of climate risk in a way that points to solutions for the future, and also recognize that if reform fatigue and the legal risks of doing major innovations seems daunting, there actually is a lot more that we might be able to learn from the historical record than we thought at the start. I will thank all of the students that I've worked with at the University of Miami and on other campuses during this time for their contributions. There are many other cool studies I could have featured, but didn't, and I would be very happy to take your questions.
For a couple questions. We have a mic that's going to be circulating around, so.
Like 1 or 2 questions.
1 or 2.
Hello. Thanks for this talk. It's really great. And since I couldn't take your class, I'm really happy to be here. So first is just a brief question. Are those data sets on national flood risk that your team put together public and like available? And like the more conceptual question, I guess, is how might these policies that you've kind of uncovered for their efficacy apply to contexts with a lot of informal settlements and kind of looser governance and less governance structure? Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. Shoot me an email. We have all the data available online, and also we can get it in any other format if you're curious. I think it's a great point. So much of what we looked at is contingent on the land tenure system that exists in the US as it does. I think you could expect very different patterns. Some of what I hit in terms of complexity of risk at the very start of the presentation has been heavily assessed in context of informal settlements. So for example, if you have water loss in rural areas, oftentimes that is strongly determined by deliberate choices around irrigation. Who is impacted? How do some of those patterns of urban and rural migration shift? Who ends up in informal settlements? And the same individuals who are marginalized in that rural context often are then in turn marginalized within the urban context as well. So I think there are some emerging experiments. What does it mean to create the ability to have ownership of that land? Where do we see siting of informal settlements in the hottest places or the most flood-prone places? Often there is that coincidence. Well, it's not a coincidence, but there is that co-occurrence. So I'd be happy to share some thoughts on that, and there are a number of different people doing very compelling work in that area too.
Thank you.
Another question?
Hi, thanks. Great. On the chronic heat, in the households who are too hot but not energy burdened, you mentioned AC is not working, rent was very high. Those constraints, they have no control really, but did you find people who made active choices? I'd rather bear the heat and because I want to pay for food or some other choice, not just the fact that they were constrained by rent and not functioning equipment.
Yeah, great question. And I will say what we are currently doing with the pretty extensive kind of mini ethnographies that we did and in-depth interviews is really unfolding those stories household by household. So I will have more on this. But basically what we often saw in the households who were too hot, some were young couple. They felt healthy. They were going crazy in the heat, right? They would say mental health impacts, this is almost impossible to bear. And they would try to spend the entire day out of the home. Could they go sit in a library? Could they go to the mall? Cooling spaces are a much bigger issue in a chronically hot climate. Everyone tends to feel comfortable opening a cooling shelter for 3 days. Try to have that be something available 24/7 for 6 months a year. It's been a big barrier, but we're starting to see some progress. I think what was wild was an elderly Black woman who lost her job during the pandemic and had not been able to work again, even though she, in theory, should be well into retirement age. She had been working with Catalyst Miami for years, and including with the PhD student Myra Cruz, who formerly worked at Catalyst, saying, I am way too hot at home. Like, this is my biggest issue. And she was experiencing indoor temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She was trying her hardest to cool that one room of her home. We were at the end doing daily check-ins with her, and she was basically in continuous heat stress. I mean, just really agonizing to see that, oftentimes very strongly interacting with other health issues. We saw every possible permutation. Households that were facing eviction risks over the course of the study. So heat, again, the least of their issues, but trying to balance it in there. To the dementia talk that we heard last week in this seminar series, we had one household, a number of different elderly men with seemingly a huge issue of dementia. And again, heat was the last of their issues, but kind of compounding with everything else. So I think kind of the underlying factors of how it could make existing medical issues worse, as well as then where they, many people were eligible for SNAP. Like, there was a big stacking of services already, but still there was no way to meet the total energy costs as well. Be happy to talk about it further.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.